Okay, everybody. So we want to wrap up very quickly here, just this first initial mini lecture on the core ideas related to psychoanalytic theory. I am just summarizing these. There's a lot more information in the lecture notes, and really we could talk on and on and on and on about the different core ideas of this theory, really, and any other theory. There's so much we could learn and discuss with any of these counseling theories. And so for the sake of time, though, I'm just kind of trying to summarize for you just some core foundational key ideas related to this oldest helping approach that was developed by Sigmund Freud called psychoanalytic theory. Again, remember, a counseling theory is just a helping approach, and they include core guidelines and assumptions and ideas and principles related to people, human behavior, human nature problems, those kind of things. We've already talked about how psychoanalytic theory, number one, believes that as men and women, we are complicated and complex, that our behavior and our emotions and our fear and our feelings and our motivations are mysterious and multi-layered. We talked about how this theory sort of teaches that as individuals, we have a lot of instincts, survival instincts, pleasurable instincts, sexual instincts within us, and that by nature we are kind of focused on pleasure and self-centered by nature. We talked about how this theory puts an emphasis on childhood, and that this theory teaches, Freud was a believer, that who you and I are as adults is molded and shaped in childhood. That's why we look at the world the way we do. It's why we think like we do. It's why we are who we are. Our unique personality is shaped and molded in childhood. So that's a key idea too, related to this theory, is that it puts a big emphasis on childhood experiences, good, bad, and otherwise. We also talked to you about the id, the ego, and the superego, those three parts of our human personality. The id develops first, then the superego, and then the ego. The id, that part of us that is selfish and self-centered, the superego, that part of us that wants to be loved and accepted by others, that wants to do everything right, wants to follow all the rules, kind of perfectionistic. Some of us have real strong superegos, right? And then the ego is that balancing part of our personality that hopefully in healthy individuals is really strong as we live in balance, not being overly self-centered and selfish, but also too not being overly focused on getting everything right, living in balance. So that's kind of a summary of what we talked about in the first video in part one. Let's talk about these last two ideas. Let me ask you just this question. Have you ever said anything? Has anything ever come out of your mouth and then you've wondered, where did that come from? Why did I say that? Have you ever been thinking about something or reminded of something and a memory comes up that you had never thought of in years? You had never, ever thought of. Have you ever had someone say something to you and highlight kind of what we call a blind spot? Something about you that you just had never thought about. And the more you thought about it, you realize, wow, that's true. I never thought about that. I mean, it has to do with you personally, but you've never thought about it. You'd never thought about it before. It's what we call a blind spot. Well, all of that has to do with this idea that is really kind of foundational in psychoanalytic theory. And it's another reason why Freud believed that we are complex by nature. Here it is. Freud believed that the majority of our mind is unconscious. We have both consciousness and unconsciousness, conscious awareness, unconscious awareness. Freud believed that the part of our mind, of our brain, of our mind, that we have access to at any given moment, consciousness is a very small part, and that the bulk of our mind is unconsciousness. Sort of like a iceberg that you see, the image of an iceberg. Have you ever heard the phrase, the tip of the iceberg? Well, the tip of the iceberg is the part of the iceberg you can see above the water. But usually that's just a little bitty bit of the iceberg. The bulk of the iceberg is beneath the water. Well, Freud believed that our conscious awareness is the tip of the iceberg, and our unconscious awareness is the bulk. It's beneath the water. It's the bulk of our mind. And so he had a very interesting idea that the bulk of our mind is unconscious. The bulk of our thoughts, most of our feelings are outside of our conscious awareness. And that our brain, our mind basically remembers everything, but that we don't have it in conscious awareness because our mind naturally filters things out. So one of the main purposes of our unconscious mind is it filters things that we no longer need, memories that we don't need, facts that we don't need. It filters those things away into our unconsciousness. Our mind does naturally. Our unconscious mind, Freud also believed that our unconscious mind also holds traumatic events, stressful memories, parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at. It's kind of in our unconscious mind, right? And that, so in a way, our unconscious mind kind of almost has like a self-preservation kind of a component to it, to where it's kind of our mind's way of protecting us from things that we don't want to look at and we don't want to see. So very complicated, but just the general idea that the bulk of our mind is unconscious, not conscious, but unconscious. Now, here's kind of the thing. This is a key idea. Freud believed that our unconscious mind shows itself often. So the things in my unconscious mind, Freud would say, Glenn, they pop up sometimes. Well, how do they pop up? Number one, here's an example. Freud believed that when you and I dream, have you ever heard of dream analysis? Freud was a big believer in dream analysis. And Freud believed that when we go to sleep, the door between our conscious mind and our unconscious mind opens up, and that all of our unconscious issues pop up and come out in our dreams. So maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you've heard about what's called dream interpretation or dream analysis. And so this idea of that one way our unconscious mind, the things that are unconscious kind of show themselves, is through our dreams. That's one idea. Another idea is through sarcasm or slips of the tongue. Maybe you've heard the phrase a Freudian slip. A Freudian slip is where you intend to say one thing, but you kind of say the opposite. It kind of slips out a little bit, and without even kind of thinking about it a little bit. So you might be invited to a party and you really don't want to go, and someone says, "Hey, I'm glad you're here," and you say, "Yeah, I'm mad to be here. I mean, I'm glad to be here too," right? You really don't want to be there, and so instead of saying, but you don't want to tell the person that you're mad to be there, but that's really how you feel. So without even thinking, it may come out of your mouth. And Freud believed that sometimes it slips of the tongue. Or have you ever had someone poke fun at you, kind of in a cruel, cutting way, and when you objected, they said, "I was just kidding. I didn't really mean it." You know, Freud believed that a lot of times when we use that, "Well, I was just a joke," that is a soft way for us to show what we really feel. It's a way for us to express what's really down in our heart, but to kind of puff it up a little bit so that's more acceptable. So sarcasm, slips of the tongue, jokes, those kinds of things. And then also too, there's this, we're gonna talk more about this next week. Freud also believed that a lot of times through our everyday behavior and choices, that we express our unconscious issues, especially, which we'll talk more about next week, our unresolved issues, our unresolved issues. Many, many years ago, when I was in graduate school, I wanted to become a counselor. I got my degree in psychology, and I went to a graduate program. I worked for a year after college, and I went to a graduate program to get my master's degree in counseling. And I took the test, I got in, so now I'm getting my master's degree in counseling. And one of the things, I took a couple of classes. I did, went through my first semester. And in my second semester of my graduate program, every single student had to make an appointment with one of the professors. You were assigned to a professor who was like your professor advisor. And so I was assigned to one of my professors, a guy who I'd had for a couple of classes. Now he's a therapist, psychologist by nature, he's teaching graduate school. And I had to go in for an interview with him. All of us had to do that. And when I went in for an interview, I sat across the table from him, and he said, "Tell me your story. What's your story?" I said, "Well, I want to be a counselor, whatever, 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 whatever." And he said, "Okay." He said, "Everybody says that though. Why are you really here?" And I didn't know what he meant by that. And I said, "I want to be a counselor." And he goes, "Why? Out of all the things to do in the world, why do you want to sit and talk to people about their problems?" I said, "Well, because I want to help people, whatever." And he goes, "Okay, but why? Why are you here?" And he kind of put me on the spot, and I thought I was giving him the wrong answer. I was like, you know. And he said, "No, you need to." He said, "You need to really clearly explore why you're here." He said, "Tell me about your family growing up." And I said, "Okay." So I told him about my family, and he went, "Uh-huh, He asked me if I'd ever been abused. He asked me if I'd ever been traumatized as a child. He asked me some deep questions. I wasn't really sure what he was getting at. I mean, questions no one ever asked me before. He asked me about some deeper parts of me. He asked me about some struggles. He asked me some direct questions. Do you struggle with this? Just between you and me. Some really personal, private questions. And I just answered them, right? And finally, after like 30 minutes of that little counseling session, he finally told me this. He said, Glenn, the only reason why I'm kind of putting your feet to the fire, so to speak, is because a lot of people are drawn to this profession because of their own issues, and they don't even realize it. He said, that's not always a bad thing, but it is a bad thing if you're not aware. He said, all of us have baggage that we bring. Now, some of his questions about my childhood were about some of the baggage that I brought to the table. And he said, hey, all of us have baggage. You just need to know what yours is. And you need to make sure that the reason why you want to be a therapist is for legitimate, appropriate reasons, and that you aren't trying to work through your own stuff by becoming a counselor. And I thought to myself, no, I would never do that. And his comment to me was, everybody says that. He said, everybody says that. He said, but it's not true for everybody. So he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think long and hard about that. And by the end of the semester, he said, you're in 2 classes with me. He said, I'm not going to give you your final grade until you come see me again. I was like, I felt like I was in trouble. I was in trouble. What I didn't realize was he did that with every student who was assigned to him. At the end of the semester, I went back and saw him. He said, well, you've been thinking? And I said, yeah. What do you think? And I began to be honest and began to talk to him a little bit. And he encouraged me. He said, man, I'm glad that you've chosen this profession. He said, but here's the thing. He said, a lot of times we are drawn to things because of the issues in our lives that we've never dealt with. And he said, that's not always unhealthy, but it can be unhealthy. We're drawn to people. We're drawn to relationships. We're drawn to substances. We're drawn to professions, because even good professions, sometimes because of our unconscious, unresolved issues. And I'd never, ever thought about that. And I realized, can I be honest? I realized in some ways he was right. And it wasn't a bad thing. But I realized that part of what molded me in wanting to be a helper of other people was my own stuff, my own issues. And that's not a bad thing. But I'd never thought about that. I had never one time ever considered that until he asked me that question. So that motivation was there in me, but it was unconscious. He brought it up. He brought it. We'll talk more about this next week. He brought it to my conscious awareness by asking me some direct questions and making me think about it. And suddenly the unconscious became conscious in my life and in my mind, which is good. We'll talk next week about what the danger of something being unconscious is. It's not a bad thing. This theory says that a lot of the stuff in our lives is unconscious. But there can be a danger to things remaining unconscious, because what we're not aware of, if we're not careful, it can affect us in negative ways. So that idea, the idea that sometimes the things that are in our unconscious mind show themselves through our relationships, through the men and women that we're attracted to, the professions through that we choose, our reactions, our emotions. Sometimes this I would call symbolic behavior, these symbolic behavior and choices sometimes are another way that our unconscious stuff kind of shows itself. And then there's this last idea. Another way that our unconscious issues, the things in our unconscious show themselves, is through what we call defense mechanisms. Now, my hunch is you probably have heard that term before. And I list for you in the lecture notes a good definition and some examples of defense mechanisms. A defense mechanism is a behavioral habit or a way of looking at the world that is a way for us to protect ourselves from something that we don't want to see. Most often it's unconscious. We're not even aware that we do it, but we do. And Freud believed that another way that our unconscious issues or unconscious mind shows itself is just in the way that we defend ourselves in unhealthy ways. So, for example, you're familiar with the term denial. Denial is a common defense mechanism. Denial is where if I don't want to look at something, I just refuse to look at it. And a lot of times I may not even be aware I'm doing it. So denial. You've heard of rationalization. Rationalization is kind of a cousin to denial. Rationalization is where I'm willing to look at the reality of a situation, but I twist the truth of it. And instead of accepting the full truth of it, I twist it so that it's more acceptable to me, so that I don't have to feel bad about myself. You know, we rationalize all kinds of things. You've heard of what's called compensation. Compensation is where we go the other way to an extreme. as a way to compensate for something that we feel we lack in our lives. Maybe, for example, someone grows up in a chaotic environment, and so as an adult, as a child, so as an adult, they compensate and they become real controlling and perfectionistic on the other extreme, right? As a way maybe to unconsciously compensate for the childhood that they grew up in. You may not think about this, but I'm sure none of us ever procrastinates. Procrastination is a defense mechanism. It's a way for me to wait to the very last minute to do something, as a way for me just to kind of put something off that I don't want to deal with. So procrastination is an example of a defense mechanism. Maybe you've heard of what's called projection. Projection is where I project out onto you things about me that I don't like. If that makes sense. So I'll give a real simple example, and then we'll be done. Many years ago, I was leading a group, and a guy in my group was very, very negative. I mean, from the very time he came in, it was very, very obvious. He just was very pessimistic and negative. He put everything down. He was just very pessimistic, very, very, very negative. And one night in the group, another guy in the group got to talking about about this man was talking about how his wife is really negative, this other man. And the man who was really, really negative spoke up and said, "I hate negative people." And everyone in the group was like, "What?" He's like, "Man, the worst. I can't stand to be around negative people." Now, here's the problem. He was negative. And so I confronted him and I said, "It's interesting that you said that, because have you ever noticed that you're kind of negative?" And he said, "Who?" I said, "You." He goes, "When?" I said, "All the time." He said, "No, I'm not." And everybody in the group was like, "Yeah, you are." And you could tell by the look on his face, he was stunned that we perceived him as negative. And as he was talking, I thought in my mind, this is what Freud would call projection. His comment about how I can't stand being around negative people is really, Freud would say, that is a way of him denying that he is negative. He sees in other people what he doesn't want to see in himself. And deep down inside, he probably doesn't like the fact that he's real negative. He probably knows. He just doesn't want to look at it. So sometimes we're not careful. We project out onto other people what we don't like about ourselves, right? So if we don't trust ourselves, we don't trust others. If we feel deep down inside, if deep down inside we know we are not an honest person, we assume everyone else is dishonest. It's called projection. We do it all the time, right? And those are just examples. Compensation, regression, repression, denial, rationalization, projection, all of those are examples of common defense mechanisms. They're ways of responding to situations in our world that oftentimes are not always conscious and they're not always healthy, but they have a goal to protect ourselves. It's a way for me to subconsciously, unconsciously protect myself from something that I do not want to see. And so it's a way for us to kind of survive, right? So there you go. So just some really, really core ideas. We could talk about so much more related to psychoanalytic theory, but for this first module that we're looking at, just some core key ideas. Go through and read the lecture notes. Go through and read the chapter and with the pages that I've given to you in the module. Read Dr. Corey, who wrote our textbook. Read his description of Freud's key ideas. And then next week in our second module, we're going to talk a little bit more about unconsciousness. We're going to talk a little bit more about that thing I was talking about a minute ago, about how this idea that sometimes one of the ways our unconscious mind shows itself is through our behavior or through our problems. And this idea of making the unconscious conscious, just like my former professor did with me. I had a blind spot in my life. He could tell I had not thought about why I wanted to be a counselor. So he challenged me to look at something that was hard for me to see. And the more I thought about it, I began to see it. So we'll talk more about that next week, how in this theory, one of our goals in helping people is to help make the unconscious conscious. Have a great week of studying about Freud's core ideas, watching the videos, looking at the lecture notes, doing your homework, your discussion question. I will see you next week. Have a good one.